A developing story if you're just joining us. A second edited clip of Donald Trump was aired by the BBC on the Newsnight programme. That's the second major BBC brand caught up in this fake news row. Now, the BBC have apologised for the Panorama clip, but it seems that this is even worse because a former Trump advisor called out the misleading clip whilst on Newsnight. Nothing was done, no reaction from the corporation. Well, let's get reaction now from somebody that would most happily bring the BBC to heel. It is former Government Minister Sir John Redwood. Sir John, welcome to Morning Glory.
Good morning. Good to hear some common sense.
Well, we try. And Sir John, I know we'll get that from you in spades regarding the BBC. Those at the Beeb cannot now claim that the Panorama clip was in isolation. This seems to be cultural within the corporation.
Well, indeed, and they should immediately rush out an apology for that and say that they've cancelled all references to that in future, because they have put the BBC and licence fee payers into a very difficult position, because whilst they've now met two of the President's immediate requirements on them to avoid a lawsuit, they haven't offered any compensation, and they have pooh-poohed the idea that they did any damage by this misrepresentation.
What do you make of stars like John Simpson and Nick Robinson of the Today programme on the BBC circling the wagons to defend the corporation, calling this a right-wing conspiracy?
Well, I think they're quite wrong, and I notice that the BBC is not putting up senior management spokesmen or women to argue their case, and so the BBC is left running a thing about, of course, we got nothing wrong, without taking the management view into account and without having a proper defence from the people who will make the calls over whether they're going to end up in court and how they're going to defend themselves.
So, John, are there parallels between the BBC and the so-called bureaucratic blob, who many would argue are in the grip of leftist progressive ideology?
Well, I think that's right, and you see it across the board. And Michael Prescott, when he was reviewing the BBC in that good report, set up many other issues from the war in Gaza through to matters about race and sexuality. But I find in the economic sphere, there's no common sense in the Treasury and Bank of England blob, who are losing us a fortune and pushing us into a combination of recession and above normal inflation. And what about net zero? And we have these deeply damaging net zero policies, which mean that we close down our industry and import things from abroad, putting up world CO2 whilst killing well-paid jobs and losing lots of tax revenue. The blob is sometimes ridiculous, and yet they will not accept criticism. And the BBC wouldn't let somebody on like me to make these points, which your channel very wisely listens to.
Well, I had the privilege of interviewing you during the pandemic, Sir John, when you were, of course, a long-standing Conservative MP. You took objection to the COVID measures given the economic impact. Well, here we are. We've suffered enormous damage to the economy, a huge national debt, a deficit as well, over £100 billion a year just to service the debt on our interest. Meanwhile, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, as reported by The Times today, is not going to U-turn on a suggestion that she would raise income tax to fill her black hole. What do you think the Chancellor is going to do later this month?
Well, I hope she does U-turn on that ridiculous idea. She looked like a hostage that morning that they wheeled her out to make a statement which implied she was going to put up income tax, and she looked terribly miserable about the whole thing. Putting up income tax now would be bad for the economy because there's not enough spending power and investment already. And it would be dire politics for the Labour Party, already languishing in the polls at unusually low levels. And if you break a fundamental promise like that, it's normally the long-term end of the government. But what is she going to do? Well, I think she will do it by stealth. I think she will freeze the tax thresholds for longer so that more and more people on not great incomes will be paying the much higher rate of tax that people have to pay. And there are lots of other little pockets she's thinking of raiding. She doesn't seem to like property owners. She doesn't seem to like savers. She doesn't seem to like entrepreneurs. She doesn't seem to like small businesses. And we see them still considering a whole series of measures which would damage all those people even more, the very people that can get us out of the mess by working harder, investing more and creating more prosperity.
Sir John, briefly if you can, given the fact that the Parliamentary Labour Party will not allow the government to cut spending, as we saw earlier this year with an effort to reduce the cost of disability benefits. We're not going to cut, we're not going to raise income tax. As you mentioned, there will be other stealth taxes. Doesn't this spell doom in the markets? Do you think we're heading for potentially a crash in the months ahead?
Well, I hope not, and I think they can avoid it, and I think they're more likely to avoid it by the bad measures of extra taxes. And then, of course, we'd be round the doom loop again, because they won't collect all the revenue they want because the economy will be so sluggish. But what they can do is there are spending cuts that could be considerably better designed than the foolish ones they tried to embark on with their own backbenchers. And they could start with the Bank of England. Why is it losing such a fortune of our money? Taxpayers are having to pay for the Bank of England's losses when they're eminently avoidable. If they just did what the European Central Bank does, and they normally like tying themselves to Europe, they could save us billions.
Sir John, always a privilege to have you on the show. We'll catch up soon. Sir John Redwood there, shooting from the hip now that he's out of the House of Commons. Not that he was backward in coming forward whilst a serving MP, former government minister. Your reaction to what Sir John has had to say? Are we heading for a crash?